Hi, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Brainstorm with Matt Gray here on YouTube. I'm meteorologist Matt Gray, and something a little bit different this week. It is March 6th, 2022, and some interesting weather history and some sad weather history as well. Here in the Pacific Northwest, another anniversary of that passed this past week, March 1st, the deadliest avalanche still in the history of the United States, and it happened right here in the Northwest. So let's go over this, and this is a bit more about not just this one particular event, but also how 1910 was a incredibly bad year for people living in the Northwest because it was one disaster after another. And it all started with the weather in February and early March of that year. So let's bring you to where this happened. So, some of you are, I'm sure, aware of Stevens Pass, and approximately on the yellow dot on your screen, that's where Stevens Pass is located. And in the early 1900s, over 100 years ago, this was one of the only really known viable routes to Seattle from eastern Washington, and by and large the rest of the country. And more importantly, this was one of the first railroad lines to reach Seattle from the Midwest. So high technology transportation of the time. Certainly does not feel that way now, but it was here on the eastern side of Stevens Pass where this avalanche eventually occurred. So let's take a look here at the Great Northern Railway around Stevens Pass, circa 1910. So, what the railroad had done is they realized that they couldn't get their trains over the summit without digging a tunnel. Plus, this is an area that averages over 400 and in some years gets well into the 500 inches of snow per year. It is a tremendous challenge. In fact, we just saw this year that it's even a tremendous challenge now. After all, Stevens Pass, after that big storm in early January, was closed for about a week while they were clearing off the snow. So this is a tremendously challenging part of Washington, part of the United States, part of the world to get across in the wintertime. And so initially there was the original Cascade Tunnel, which was built basically right off the summit here. You can see that on the map. And there was a work camp for train crews on the eastern side of this Cascade Tunnel. That place was called Wellington, and unfortunately this, right where all of these people lived and worked and tried to keep the railroad open, is where this disaster took place over 110 years ago on the 1st of March. So let's look at some of the weather content, or the weather factors that were leading up to this disaster before it occurred. So this is average snowfall for the Spokane area in 1910. Notice what happens here during the month of February. So it was a dry start to the month as far as snowfall goes, but then look what happens. Very, very quickly, as we go from basically the 8th of February, the 9th of February, to the 27th of February, so basically a good portion of the month, we ended up with 13.5 inches in Spokane. Now imagine what's going on up in the mountains as a result. So keep in mind this chart here about how there was a lot of snow on the ground because temperatures were very cold at this time as well. In fact, even just a few days before, right around this late February time period, temperatures were in the sub-zero range at night. So all of the snow was still on the ground as we entered late February and early March. Keep that in mind because this is going to be important later when we talk about some other impacts around the inland Northwest itself of this weather that also ended up causing this avalanche. Now, we got another weather chart for you. This is about the closest weather station that we have with records that go back to 1910. Closest to Stevens Pass, and yes, it's a long ways away in Snoqualmie Falls, but I'm using this to illustrate that once the snow stopped in late February, the rain kept going. So we were talking about daily accumulations. You can see here, February 27th, 1910, almost 1.5 inches of not snow accumulation, but rain accumulation. Another 0.8 inches the next day. And on the 1st, 1.2 inches of rain. And it was rain all the way up to the summit of Stevens Pass. Now, likely what this says to me is this was another one of these atmospheric rivers. There was also reports from witnesses at the time that there was thunder and lightning around Stevens Pass when this disaster occurred. So, keep this in mind. Now, let's talk a little bit more about this place, Wellington. This is an image, kind of shows you the layouts of the railroad tracks, the work camp here. And because of all the heavy snow, there were trains that had been stuck here for the better part of a week because of other avalanches and then the fact that snow could not be cleared. In fact, here in some of my source material, that there were 2 trains that were carrying people that were stuck up there on February 23rd, and the avalanche didn't occur until the 1st of March. So it just shows you how snowed in this issue was, or how snowed in the mountains were, when an extraordinarily cold and snowy weather event happened before this next system came in, warmed everything up, and sheets of water were falling on top of the snow. Now, if you spent any time in the backcountry, you know that that is a recipe for avalanches. And unfortunately, that is exactly what happened on the mountains right above this community of Wellington, where you had hundreds of people working for the Great Northern Railroad and the passengers of one of these trains that were sitting there. And so accounts say that right before midnight the avalanche happened. So in the dark of night, nobody's paying attention, and basically the whole mountain fell away. Only 23 people ended up surviving, and the Wellington area went from a place like this to this. So this ended up being something that took the lives of 96 people, most of them being the railroad workers who were trying to keep this stretch of railroad open. And this would be, unfortunately, just the beginning for a year of awful weather around the inland Northwest. I mentioned before that there was lots of snow on the ground around Spokane. So let's take a look at some of the source material. The Spokane Daily Chronicle, March 2nd, reporting 60 dead in the train avalanche. But also, look what happens when you scroll down further. Leda Creek, train bridges washed out. No trains to Moscow. So what this shows you is that, obviously, Stevens Pass, not the only place where rain was falling on top of snow. The dramatically warm temperatures were causing the rivers to rise and flood, and in some cases, incredibly fast. Look at the paper for the next day. Hundreds homeless at Colfax. If you've driven through the Palouse, you know that all roads go through Colfax and that it's in a pretty low-lying area. So no surprise here that when you have this type of disaster, you're talking about, and you can see here right in the front page of this paper, parts of Colfax sitting underwater. And in fact, they estimated at the time that the losses were almost $300,000. Now, you can imagine how much money that would be in today's inflation. It would be an incredible amount. And the next day's report from the papers, talking about landslides stopping trains from the Northern Pacific, a separate railroad. So you had landslides, you had massive flooding, bridges washed out everywhere. This, at the time, considering that the city of Spokane was only 40 years old, had to be one of the, if not the, worst disaster at the time since the wildfires back in the 1880s. And so this was the scenario that people were dealing with in early 1910. I'll bring you back to the map here with Wellington. In fact, the disaster, being that almost 100 people died, was so horrific, they actually renamed the town of Wellington to the town of Ty, Great Northern Railway also ended up building lots of avalanche sheds to try and protect the trains, but ultimately in 1929, you can see in this dashed line here, they built a much longer and much safer tunnel to avoid this sort of disaster ever happening again. Now, let's get back to the floods and why I said at the beginning of the video that 1910 might have been the worst weather disaster year ever around the Northwest. Lots of rain came in February, but apparently not much came after that. After flooding in February, barely a drop of rain seemed to fall for the rest of the year, and by the time August came around, it was a tinderbox. And, once again, trains played a role, where railroad construction happening in the mountains of Idaho was sparking off wildfires, and so became what is the worst series of wildfires in the history of America, the Great Burn. Some people call it the Big Burn, from August 20th to the 21st of 1910. In the span of about 48 hours, 3 million acres burned in Washington, Idaho, and Montana, and a lot of this was in the heart of the inland Northwest. About half the town of Wallace ended up burning, and once again, dozens and dozens of people, it's estimated about 86 people at least, most of them trying to be firefighters, perished in this disaster as well. And you can still see the scars that the 1910 fires left on this landscape, especially around the Lookout Pass area on both the Idaho and the Montana side. You can still see that today, where there's a lot of hillsides that should have a lot more trees on them than there are. So it's hard to imagine, especially in an era of history where a lot of people thought that they had basically conquered Mother Nature. Remember, this is 2 years before an unsinkable ship named the Titanic sank because it hit an iceberg. So you're talking about probably the psyche of people who lived in that era must have really been shaken with avalanches and severe flooding and then wildfires, all within the span of a few months of each other. So 1910, probably one of the worst years in the history of the Northwest as far as disasters go. All right, so that is a little historical dive and how the weather played a role in this edition of the Brainstorm. If you liked what we did here, subscribe to 4 News Now on YouTube. Put out videos every week and keep you informed on everything going on around the Spokane and Coeur d'Alene region. Have a great night.